Okay, welcome everybody. I think we'll get started, and welcome to the data collection webinar series. As more people come on, maybe I'll ask Attila, would you like to say a few words?
Yes, thank you very much, Archana. I hope you can all hear me well.
Yes, we can.
Thank you. Well, good morning and good afternoon, good evening to everyone. Thanks very much for joining. Today's webinar is on the census. We have our presenter ready, Ian White, who will be presenting today. It's about developing a census methodology that is fit for purpose in changing times. We are very excited about this topic. We resumed our webinar series last week with your report. Very interesting presentation. And this week we are covering the census. And in the following weeks, we are going to be covering a diverse set of methodologies on data collection. So we are really looking forward to this presentation and to the discussion afterwards. But at this point, I would like to give the floor to my colleague, Archana, to introduce the webinar to us, and then we will proceed. Archana?
Thank you, Attila. So my name is Archana Dwivedi, and I work with the Data Collection Unit in the Data and Analytics section at headquarters. And as Attila mentioned, today's seminar is about population census. And we're very lucky to have Ian White be the presenter today. So a little bit about this. So the COVID-19 pandemic has accelerated the need for National Statistical Offices around the world to review the way they are able to collect information from the decennial censuses of population and housing. The webinar will discuss some of the issues that affect the methodology, functions, and processes of the census set within the context of the global pandemic, the increasing reliance on the use of administrative data for statistical purposes, and the need to collect information generally in the journey towards achieving Sustainable Development Goals. Our speaker, Ian White, is an international census consultant. Prior to his retirement in 2014, he worked with the UK's Office for National Statistics on each census in England and Wales since 1971. He was the editor of the United Nations Economic Commission of Europe's recommendation for the 2021 round of censuses in the region, and was a member of a UN-appointed international team of experts advising the Myanmar government on the conduct of the first census there in 30 years. He is currently working with UNFPA on the preparation of the forthcoming censuses in Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Ukraine, and Moldova, and in the preparation of an e-learning course for countries moving to a register-based census methodology. He is also working with the Statistical Office in Albania on the planning for the next census there. He is looking also to publish his long-awaited book on the history of the census in the UK next year. So before we move on, just a few housekeeping items. So we've scheduled the seminar today for about an hour and a half. After the presentation, we will take Q&A. As always, throughout the webinar, kindly remain muted. Please write your questions in the chat box, and we will try to group these questions and direct them to Ian during the Q&A session. Please note that the webinar is being recorded and will be available on our SharePoint site for UNICEF colleagues, together with where past webinars are also located. You can find the link in the email that you have received, and we will also share it in the chat box. We also have plans to post these webinars on a public site in the near future, so other colleagues outside of UNICEF can also have access to them. So Ian, the floor is yours. Over to you.
Thank you, Archana. I hope everyone can see me and see the presentation. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, wherever you are. Just so that you have some idea what we're going to be covering today, this is what I plan to briefly cover. We'll look at the definition and essential features of the census, the units of enumeration, who is actually included, what units are included. Briefly talk about the recommended data items to be collected, the topics that are usually covered in a census. I'll say something particular about SDG indicators, for which the census is increasingly being used. Data collection methodologies, well, that's probably the focus of the presentation, and we'll be looking at particularly the move from traditional censuses to the use of registers. I'll say briefly about enumerating the hard to count, a particular issue that is relevant not only to current censuses, but to use data using registers. We'll look at the indications of what is success or useful data, and then a little bit more speculative, we'll have a peek into the future and the use of administrative data in the future. Right, just so that we all know what we're talking about, and I'm sure you all know this, the UN defines the population housing census as the total process of planning, collecting, compiling, evaluating, disseminating, analyzing, and quality assessing a selection of demographic, economic and social data at the national and local level. The full definitions there. That's a big subject, far too much for an hour. So we'll be just looking at one aspect of the operational activities, and that is of data collection. Though I will also briefly discuss the importance of quality assessment for ensuring that the data collected are indeed useful and fit for purpose. Now, I'm sure we all agree that the information of a country's population and housing census is basic to the production and distribution of material wealth in the country. In order to plan and implement economic and social development and administrative policies, or the need for scientific research, it is necessary to have reliable and detailed information on the size and distribution of the composition of the population and its housing stock. And the population census is, of course, the primary source of these benchmark statistics. So, because of the census is seen as so important, the UN has recommended that all countries produce detailed population and housing statistics at the national and regional level, and for small areas, at least once in the period 2015 to 2024, centered on the year 2020, and that's the round of censuses that are currently in progress. Now, censuses are distinguished from any other type of data collection activity by aiming to encompass 5 essential features. Individual enumeration means that every household, person and living quarters in the country are enumerated and their characteristics separately recorded. Now, this of course enables the linkage and cross-classification of data on the various topics reported on, and provides for extensive multivariate analysis to be made. Universality, that means that the census should cover the whole of the country or a precisely defined region within the country, and it should include every person and every household or dwelling that's in the area. Of course, this doesn't preclude the use of sampling techniques for obtaining data on say, specific characteristics particular characteristics of the population, providing that the sample design is consistent with the size of the area for which the data is to be tabulated. Simultaneity, each person and each set of living quarters is enumerated at the same well-defined point in time, and that the data collected refers to a well-defined reference period. Now, this isn't always possible. If the data is not all collected simultaneously, adjustments can be made so that the reported data have the same reference period. For most of the data, this will be the day of the census, but in some instances, in relation to some of the employment characteristics, for example, it may be a specified period prior to the census, usually a week, but it can be a year. However, as we will see a bit later on, where information is taken from independent administrative registers, it may be difficult to relate the data from different sources to the same reference period. It should have a defined periodicity. That is, censuses should be taken at regular intervals so that comparable time series can be produced for a fixed sequence. data from a regular series of censuses makes it possible to assess the past, accurately describe the present, and importantly, project into the future. Now, the UN recommends that the national census should be taken every 10 years. Some countries do it every 5 years. But of course, the increasing use of administrative data, as we will see, makes it possible to produce census type data on an even more frequent basis. And finally, the capacity to produce small area statistics. Because the census is universal, it should be able to produce data on the number of characteristics of the population down to the lowest appropriate geographical area level that is relevant to the country. Such small areas may be the lowest level of the country's administrative geography. Here's an example of the areas in Uzbekistan that I've been working on. But it could be areas created specifically for the census. And increasingly now the use of grid square geography is increasingly being adopted, offers both a greater level of international comparison and greater potential for mapping census data. Now, these essential features, particularly the individual enumeration and simultaneity, relate to different types of enumeration units, such units which will form the basis of subsequent tabulations. Now, these should include the following: individual persons. Well, clearly, everyone should be collected individually, and then they can be gathered together in households and families, and also into particular population subgroups, which may be required for particular analytical purposes, such as students, the labor force, migrants, the disabled, and so on. Households. Now, households are a common unit. A lot of census data is produced at the household level, and a household may be either a one-person household, that is to say, a person who makes provision for his or her own food or other essentials, that's the census definition, or it could be a multi-household, a multi-person household, that is to say, a group of 2 or more people who make common provision for food and other essentials. Now, such a household, the people in such a household may group their resources together to have a common budget, and where they do so, the arrangement is often called the housekeeping concept of definition. And under such a definition, there can be more than one household, for example, living in the same housing unit. However, some countries adopt a very different approach in that, which is called the dwelling concept, in that all people living in the same housing unit are regarded as belonging to the same household. And as we will see, this has quite severe implications when it comes to using register-based data. The census can identify a family, which is members of the household which are related within the household to a specific degree, and the composition of families is usually derived from information collected on the relationship to the household head. Dwellings are collected as a unit, or living quarters, they're sometimes called. They may be either constructed or built for human habitation, and or they may be not built for human habitation, but are inhabited at the time of the census, and they are distinguished usually in the classification of dwellings. And then finally, buildings. Now, the concept of a building is somewhat wider than that of a dwelling, and for the purpose of the census, a building is defined as an independent structure containing one or more dwellings, whether used for residential or non-residential purposes. Now, it may be that some censuses will only collect information on buildings where they have people living in them. Other censuses may collect information on all buildings, whether they are residential or not. So those are the units that we're talking about. Let's just briefly talk about the topics that the census will include, because this will have an implication for moving from a traditional census to a register-based census, which we will talk about in a minute. So there's always a demand, I think, for users for a far greater number of data items to be collected in the census than is practicable, particularly in a traditional census where the information is collected directly from the public by means of a questionnaire. So that the National Statistical Offices need to impose a certain number of criteria in deciding which topics to include. So they must meet a significant and clearly demonstrated user need, usually determined by an extensive program of consultation. Such information must be required at the small geographic area level or for small population subgroups. If information is only required at the national level, it may be more economic and viable to collect the information with a survey. The census allows you to hone down to very small areas. The data practicable questions have to be devised that do not require lengthy explanations or instructions. And of course, this is relevant for a questionnaire. The requirement should be to undertake multivariate analysis. There's no point in collecting information on a subject which cannot then be cross-analyzed by other census variables. There should be no adverse effect on public response. I don't put a question in the census that people don't like and won't answer. The data should be required for statistics only. There should not be any sectarian or political reasons for asking information. And the burden on the public should be kept to a minimum. Questionnaires with hundreds or a lot of questions on are not usually acceptable. So in the context of the design of the census, the UN have recommended that topics be categorized in several sorts of ways, and I will just note that in order to achieve uniformity and consistency across censuses across the world, the UN have published periodically for every cycle of censuses, their principles and recommendations for the housing censuses. The UN Statistical Division prepares this. The current issue is the third edition. And also to enhance that, the UNECE, for countries in the UNECE region, which is mainly Europe, but North America as well, publish a similar set of recommendations to accompany each round of censuses there. They define or classify topics as either core or non-core or derived. Core topics are those that have been traditionally regarded as being essential for providing the key information that meets most national and local user requirements. And non-core topics are those whose inclusion may in general be considered less vital and are therefore optional to some degree, though some countries, because of their particular circumstances, may well regard them as equally as important as the core topics. And depending on their own national circumstances, of course, data requirements, countries will and do include other topics in the census as well. And then there are derived topics. Now, these are topics which are derived from the information already collected. That is, the relevant information is not collected directly in response to, say, a specific question, but can be described from other information already collected in the census. For example, size of household or type of family. You don't ask a question to determine those issues. They can be derived from information collected. Now, those recommendations actually cover a whole range of different topics, and I don't want to go into all of these. If people are interested in the sorts of topics that are included in the particular topics that are included in these general descriptions, by all means, you can refer to the guidelines and the recommendations that we've just noted, or maybe we can discuss these at the end. But I will just note that the demographic topics of age, sex, and marital status are particularly key to the census, as most variables, certainly for age and sex, most other census variables are cross-analyzed by these two topics. And the UN actually recommend that if you don't get responses to these from, say, a traditional questionnaire, then this sort of data should be imputed. Economic topics are clearly characteristics of economic characteristics are needed to establish a comprehensive picture of the economic structure. And the sorts of questions that are generally asked are on occupation, industry, status of employment, and place of work. Educational topics are very important, particularly in connection with children. And school attendance and literacy are now regarded as usually very common in most censuses, and are recommended to be included. Migratory movements, both international and internal, are generally increasing in both complexity and volume, and we'll be talking about this a little bit later on. So that questions on migration have been increasingly included in censuses in recent years, and typically will cover data on, for example, country or place of birth, citizenship, whether persons ever resided abroad, and year of arrival. But I won't say more than that at the moment, because we will be talking about migration a bit later on. International migration, of course, inevitably brings diversity, resulting in multi-ethnic, multiracial, and multilinguistic societies. So data on ethno-cultural characteristics are now of increasingly importance, and they will include questions on ethnic group, mother tongue, knowledge of other languages, and religious denominations. Disability can be inquired in the census. For countries that don't have regular population-based disability surveys, the census can be often the only source of information on the extent and degree of disability at the national and local level. And then, as I've already noticed, there's a range of data on household and family topics, particularly the relationship between household members, in order to determine household and family composition. And questions on household amenities, such as, for example, number of cars, telephone and internet connection, can often provide information to create indices of affluence and deprivation. And then finally, dwellings and buildings. So the fundamental purposes of all this data, of course, is to provide facts essential to the national policy making and planning and administration of the country. By providing comparable basic statistics as a whole and for each administrative unit, the census can make an important contribution to the overall planning process and management of national affairs. Now, time does not permit me to examine the various uses in detail. These are well documented, but it may be relevant within the context of UNICEF's main interests to note briefly the use of census information to derive some of the 230 or more indicators that can help NSOs to monitor their progress in meeting many of the Sustainable Development Goal targets. For example, Goal 1, end poverty in all forms of everywhere. Well, national progress towards meeting this rather ambitious goal can be measured by 4 key indicators derived from information that can be collected in the census. In particular, the proportion of men, women, and, of course, children living in poverty according to national definitions. Now, the measurement of poverty can be derived directly from if the census is designed to collect information on personal or household income. However, because this is a particular sensitive topic, income is not a topic that is assigned core status by the UN, and and so not all countries will include such a question in their census. However, indirect measures of poverty or deprivation can be derived, as we've seen, from some of the information collected on household amenities and housing conditions. There's another goal to ensure healthy lives and promote well-being for all at all ages. And I pick out two here, which two indices that can help measure this, which can be obtained from data from the census if information is collected on fertility and mortality of household members. Goal 4, ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. Well, we've already seen that education is a topic that is included in the census, and this indicator can be particularly relevant here by measuring the level of participation in organized learning and the proportion of children and young people achieving a particular level of literacy and numeracy skills. And education questions are designed to collect this information. And there are other goals there as well, which can to which census data can be particularly addressed. I won't go into them in any detail at the moment. So, how do we collect all this information? Now, since the 2000 round, the methodology for collecting census data has changed dramatically in many countries, particularly in Europe. Many have moved away from the traditional wholly doorstep collection by enumerators and have instead adopted either a completely or partially register-based approach while attempting to reduce both costs and the burden on the public, but at the same time producing more regular and up-to-date statistical information. So just briefly, the three types of methods that are currently being used: the traditional census, and by this we mean it's typically exemplified by the collection of data directly from respondents in the field by enumerators. The register-based census, in which all information is collected from several and independent administrative registers and then linked to create a statistical database. And the combined approach, in which elements of both types are combined. Now, I've got some slides here on the methods, on the traditional methods of the census, but I am assuming we are all pretty familiar with this, so I will not devote too much time. I'd like to concentrate on the issues surrounding the register-based census. But when you get these slides, eventually you'll be able to refer to them. Essentially, there are two methods of traditional census collecting, either on the doorstep or by a telephone interview, or increasingly now with electronic means online with a self-completion questionnaire. I will note, however, at this stage, though, where the census uses more than one approach to collecting data, National Statistical Offices should be aware of multi-mode data collection bias. Now, an NSO may well use more than one method to collect data to increase the overall response rates by minimizing the differential rates between different population groups. But they do need careful planning because of the bias caused by the way that the data is collected. So the basic preconditions for the traditional census are good address list, high level of literacy, public cooperation, and there are the advantages: comprehensive coverage, and particularly I'll pick up greater flexibility in deciding the topics to be covered. You can always put in a question on a questionnaire to reflect current or upcoming issues. And for example, several countries in the current round have included questions on the impact of COVID-19 because they were able to do this at the last minute. But there are disadvantages, and the complexity and high costs and declining response rates are among those. But as I say, I won't go into those in any detail. Instead, I'd like to focus on the register-based census. Now here, in this basic approach, there is no field enumeration at all. The data is collected by the Statistical Office solely from information on individuals, households, dwellings and buildings held on administrative registers, usually under the control of other government departments. Data held on such registers are accessed by the NSO and then linked at the unit record level to create a statistical database from which a set of census type cross-tabulations can be produced in the way that has been done traditionally. Now, although the content and process of merging these registers will differ from one country to another, the broad range of registers are pretty similar. So they will include the registers listed there, including business registers, tax registers, social security registers, and education registers. The preconditions are important. Countries should not attempt to, will not attempt to use a register-based system unless a number of preconditions are in place. They must have legal authority to do so. There must be a unique way of linking the data together. I mean, it is theoretically possible to link data from different records based on name, sex, and say address, but the existence of a unique identification number within the country for each individual allows much more effective and reliable linkage of records from sometimes very disparate and different registers. Indeed, the absence of a unified system and an established population register makes it extremely difficult and laborious, if not impossible, for countries to link data from different registers. There must be a common set of definitions and concepts. There must be public acceptance of the use of their data, which has been provided for non-statistical purposes. And particularly, there should be a good dialogue between the National Statistical Office and the data holders themselves, because the Statistical Office will not have responsibility for the data. It is totally reliant on the data holders for cooperation. And finally, the NSO itself should have sufficiently well-trained staff in place before it attempts to do this. The clear advantages are reduced costs. The highest cost element of a traditional census is its labor costs for enumerating the field operation, the enumerators and the supervisors. That's eliminated. And also the greater frequency of data is able to be produced. Censuses on a 5 or 10 year basis are infrequent, and also there are delays in producing the data because of the processing involved. Use of administrative data allows a greater frequency of data with less public burden. The public is not bothered by the effort of having to fill in questionnaires. However, there are disadvantages. Data is held in registers for non-statistical purposes. Therefore, definitions and concepts may be different. And we will talk about some of these in our look into the future at the end of the session. But I pick up things like population base, household, and the be different. The concepts may be different. Updating may not be regular. Different registers will be updated to different time frequencies. Therefore, the concept of simultaneity may be difficult to achieve. There is reduced flexibility. The NSO will be dependent on the data contained in the register. They will have no control necessarily over what is in the register. And if that registers tend to have the same data year in, year out, because they're collected for administrative purposes. If the Census Office wants to introduce a new topic into the census, it may not be able to do so through the use of registers because the data may not be there. And there is less control by the NSO over what data is actually obtained. So, how is the register-based census compliant with the essential features that we talked about earlier? Well, yes, individual enumeration is correct. Universality, registers usually cover the whole country, not always, but usually. Periodicity is well catered for. Data is usually available on a continuous basis and can be produced ideally under annually, or even less, or even more frequently. Simultaneity is an issue. Not all the data will relate to the same period of time, and there may need to be methodological estimation methods to account for that. And the small area statistics element is in fact met indeed, because usually data is addressed. Most register-based data is address coordinated, so small areas can be collected. Now, where countries aren't able to get some standard data items from a register, they may either have to drop that topic from the census altogether, or collect them in other alternative ways. And you could use a survey or a full enumeration to do that. And using this system is referred to as the combined approach, because you're combining the use of registers and a field enumeration at the same time. Now, the use of survey or enumeration data is intended to not only improve the accuracy of the population counts, and provide information for variables that cannot reliably obtain from administrative data, but also they can provide checks and updates to improve the data that is derived from administrative sources, and additionally link in variables as and when they are demanded. Additionally, they can provide a linking frame to bring together other sources. As we will see shortly, the move to a combined census is gaining popularity in many countries. Now, there are preconditions, advantages, and disadvantages in using a combined method approach. They're on the slides here. I'm going to leave these for you to look at in detail when you see them later. We can pick up these points in questions and answers at the end, but I want to go on to other issues before we finish. In every country, there are particular population groups for whom special arrangements have to be made, and this is particularly the case when you're moving from one data collection method to another. Developing special enumeration procedures is a complex process, because different measures are needed for the several different types of population groups that are hard to count. Now, in general, the difficulties and challenges faced by the NSO can be grouped into broad categories. Those challenges focusing on a particular subgroup of the population, and those challenges related to the type of environment which the people live. Now, there is a whole list of population subgroups that have been regarded as hard to count. I don't intend to discuss how you would resolve these all. I'll just pick up one or two examples. So, for example, young males, particularly in inner city areas, tend not to be very forthcoming in responding to questionnaires and surveys. So within the traditional census approach, they can be difficult to count. They can be difficult to identify. They can be difficult to engage. There are methods of doing that. Greater publicity will help. focused publicity is usually the answer. In the UK, for example, in 2011 census, as part of its publicity campaign, it got breweries to prepare beer mats with census questions on one side and an endorsement to answer the census questionnaire on the other side, so that and these were distributed to pubs. I'm not sure what effect it had. Response to the census was quite good, but this is a particular way that you can engage particular focus on a particular group. Newborn babies. At the time of the census, notices went out into maternity hospitals to remind mothers to when they get home to register their babies in the census. It is quite common for newborn babies, particularly firstborn babies, to be overlooked when it comes to making a census forms. So these are a list of hard to count population groups who, even in a traditional census, are difficult to count. Some of them may be some of the problems may be resolved in moving to a register-based census, but others aren't. I pick up the homeless, for example. Homeless, which comprise of people who are what I'd call roofless, people who don't have anywhere to live. They are sleep in the street, for which one type of approach can be adopted by training special enumerators, for example, to go out on census night and search these people out. And then there are the rootless, people who are, or sofa surfers, I think they're sometimes referred to, whereby people don't have a usual place of residence. They just sleep on someone's sofa, friends or neighbors, and they're enumerated wherever they happen to be on census night. So there are categories of hard to count people that for which different strategies have to be adopted in order to count them in the census. So as an element of in this series of UNICEF webinars on data collection, speakers have been asked to cover the issue of what does success look like, or what is useful data. Now, for census takers, this has always been a matter of concern in every census. In evaluating the success of any census, and particularly the quality of data, it is internationally conventional to consider a number of quality dimensions. And these are the ones that normally refer. So accuracy, defined as the degree to which information correctly describes the phenomena it is designed to measure, and is usually characterized in terms of error and coverage. It is arguably the most important dimension, but it is worth noting some of the others. Relevance. The challenge for the census program is to balance the conflicting user requirements in order to satisfy the most important needs within the resource constraints. Timeliness refers to any delay between the reference point, usually census day, and the date on which the information becomes available. Now, often for a census, there is several releases or several dates in which data is released. But typically there is a trade-off between accuracy and timeliness. The more effort you put into ensuring that the data are accurate, the longer it takes to make that data available. Accessibility of statistical information refers to the ease with which it can be obtained by the user. This includes not only the ease in which the existence of the data is made known, but also the suitability and format of the medium through which the information can be accessed. To maximize the benefit of any census data collected and to justify the costs, data should be widely accessible to all potential users. Within the context of the register-based data system, accessibility also refers to the ease in which the NSO itself can acquire the data from the register holders. Not always an easy task, I might add. Interpretability reflects the availability of explanatory material, supplementary information, metadata necessary to interpret the user, to interpret and use it. And now this information would cover the underlying concepts, definitions and variables, classifications, and the methodology of the data collection process. And it would include indications of accuracy and quality of the data. And again, it applies both to the user and the NSO. When the NSO obtains data from a register that it does not control, it needs to understand and be able to interpret the data. And lastly, coherence reflects the degree to which census information can be brought together with other statistical information from other sources within a broad analytical framework. And the use of standard concepts, definitions and classifications, possibly agreed at the international level, promotes coherence. Now, the degree of coherence can be assessed via a program of validation of the census information, comparing it to corresponding data from other surveys and administrative sources. But you need to measure this success. Now, looking at data quality itself as a particular dimension, methods for evaluating data quality will largely depend on the type of errors that it wants to measure. For example, coverage versus content, data availability, and the level of technical and finance resource available. Now, evaluation methods will, I suppose, differ with respect to the technical sophistication and the data requirements and the desired quality of the final results. But the methods include here post-enumeration surveys, comparisons with existing household surveys, record checks, and demographic analysis. I don't want to go into the details of this, but I will point out that there are several documents which set out guidelines for measuring and assessing data quality. And this is one that I was involved with, so I can helpfully promote it. These are guidelines on the use of registers and administrative data sources that have been prepared by UNECE. They are doing a follow-up set of guidelines on particularly on assessing the quality of data from registers. And also UNSD are in the process of preparing a e-learning course, which will include assessing the quality of data to obtain from registers. So there are other guidelines which set out how you measure success. I don't need to focus on those, although I will happily take any questions at the end if there are particular issues that need to be discussed. So looking to the future, we'll spend the last few minutes just looking at where census taking is going. Now, the methods adopted for collecting information in the census have been evolving continuously over the past decade. And this is really to reflect changes in society, especially in the public attitudes and their behavior, and also particularly the greater levels of public mobility. It's to change to meet ever demanding requirements of data users. They never get any less. To capitalize on opportunities offered by technological innovations and developments, and in statistical modeling techniques, to take advantage of a new and wide-ranging data sources, such as registers and administrative files, and particularly big data, to reduce costs and to respond to global and environmental phenomena. Most countries conduct a full census every 10 years, and although some conduct them more or less frequently, other countries are now already using alternative methods based on registers and other official sources to produce their census data. The unprecedented circumstances of the global COVID pandemic this year have no doubt accelerated the transformation from a traditional to a register-based census in many countries. The days of waiting years for clean, quality-assured, tabulated data to be made publicly available may be coming to an end. Now, we've got some figures here showing the way that the trend has been going over the last 20 years. The data's come from a number of UNECE surveys. So these figures for the moment just reflect countries in the UNECE region, which I accept are not typical. We'll talk about that in a minute. The most recent survey was carried out in 2018 and was reported in a paper called New Frontiers for Censuses Beyond 2020. Now, as can be seen in the table, in 2010, the last completed round, some 35 countries in the UNECE region, that is 2/3 of the countries, conducted a traditional census. And this was at that time still the preferred methodological approach throughout the region, but was far less so than in the year 2000. And then you can see that countries progressively have moved to a register-based census, and particularly so for the combined census. It is common, I think, for countries thinking of moving from one census to another to do this in stages. Very few countries attempt to go from a traditional census to a register-based census in one go. Lessons have to be learned, and the adoption of a combined census as an intermediate stage is usually most commonly adopted. The situation in the rest of the world isn't quite so progressive. And these additional data that I've added to the slide here refer to data that's in a report of the results of a UNSD survey on the 2020 round of population housing censuses, and there is a link to the paper there. Elsewhere in the world, you can see take-up of the register-based census is far less well developed, and in fact, pretty well, at the moment, non-existent, other than a few countries in Asia. But in Africa and Latin America, by far, well, almost exclusively, the move is to retain a traditional census. That we hope will change for the 2030 round, but my guess is that this will take some time for other countries to develop register-based systems that are accurate and linkable to provide the basis for the census. So the worldwide and social and economic disruption caused by COVID-19 continues to adversely impact the implementation of the 2020 round of censuses. Countries conducting their census in the peak years for the current round, that's 2020 and 2021, using the traditional approach, are particularly under pressure to develop action plans to minimize the impact of COVID-19 on their census taking plans. Now, a further UNSD survey was carried out this year to provide information on the impact of COVID-19 on the preparatory activities and field-based enumerations for those countries originally scheduled to carry out their censuses in 2020 and 2021. Responses were received from about just over 100 countries, and this summarizes some of the results. So you can see the census has been affected to some degree by countries taking censuses both in 2020 and 2021. These are percentage figures. Quite a few countries have had to postpone by a year or more. And certainly the field enumeration is the area in which the most effect has been seen. 95% of countries had to postpone their census. Their field enumeration has been postponed, at least in 2020, and a similar number, slightly less percentage for 2021. And similarly, a data collection method has had to be changed by more than half the countries as well. Now, some countries reported that there was no impact of COVID-19 on their census taking plans. And it's interesting to know that the reasons for this were quite the two main reasons were that field work was already completed. Clearly for 2021 that doesn't apply. But it's interesting to note that countries using administrative data sources are far less impacted by the COVID than countries that have to use a field enumeration process to a certain degree. So what's going to happen after the COVID, after the 2020 round is completed, and hopefully we'll be back to a normal census taking cycle? Well, the UNECE survey that I referred to looked into the future. And again, this is UNECE countries only. These aren't global countries. But you can see that the expectation is that the traditional census will be taken by relatively few countries, and that the register-based census, certainly in the UNECE region, becomes the predominant collection mode. But many countries will be moving from a traditional census to a combined census. So it is certainly the way forward. But in deciding to use some of the moving to the register, there are some key issues to be discussed. And in the remaining few minutes, I'd just like to briefly cover, if not go into detail, the key issues that countries are going to have to face when moving to a register-based census. And these are deciding on the population base, how to deal with people with second residences, measuring migration patterns, the definition of household, and simultaneity. Now, the population base, the people you count, can be different for different countries, even within a traditional census. Where you have a register-based census, the base is not always the same way. There's not always the same definition. I've listed there a number of different population bases that have been identified by Eurostat in a report recently. Some of them are speculative. They're ideas for future measurements. But the slide just illustrates the fact that there are different ways of measuring what you're counting. The usually resident population, for example, is a population that is defined as people that have lived in the country for 12 months or intend to live in the country for 12 months, whether they are present in the census or not. Legally resident are people who have a legal right to be in the country at any one time. A registered population might be just people that are on one or more of the registered on one or more of the registers being used. I don't really want to say much more about the future of population bases, but I will refer you to a paper written by Eurostat towards a population a single population base in the EU. There's a reference there which you can look at when you get the slides. The issue of second residences relates to the mobility of the population. There's some pictures here of examples of people who, for example, in the UK, have second residences, and therefore may well not, when they are measured in the census, may not know what their usual residence is. So it may be increasingly common for censuses to collect information on more than one residence. For example, people living on a military base, people who have a weekday residence near their workplace, people who have a weekend getaway retreat, a student living in term time at a different address from their home, second parents, a second parent's address or address of children living with separated parents, or people holidaying in the winter in Spain. The information is then used to assign persons to their correct place of residence for the purposes of the census. This may be easier easy to collect information like this on a traditional census. Will it be possible to do that on a register-based census, where registers normally only collect information on one address only? A constantly moving population also is exhibited in the migration patterns of population. Migration is far more common now, with international travel being so much easier and economic migrants being a large proportion of the migratory flow. So we might need to measure issues of circular migration, where people move regularly from one place to another, either for work, and where that such movement is frequent. UNECE have termed the term pendulum migration. This is difficult to measure in any census whatsoever. In fact, a traditional census is not a terribly good way of measuring longitudinal movements, but they may be even harder to measure in a register-based census. The definition of a household, well, we've discussed the definition of a household earlier, but where people live will actually determine what household they're living in. So where do you count people, children of parents who are separated? Where do you count students who live away from home at term time? Or where do you count people working away from home? People living temporarily in institution, what sort of household are they living in? The issue of simultaneity is, as I mentioned earlier, may be lost in the term when you're moving from a traditional census to a register-based census if the data collected are not related to the same point of time. And finally, I'd like to just look at the issue of big data. Big data is becoming increasingly used and by National Statistical Offices. The sources are becoming increasingly varied. Mobile phone data is commonly used, credit card scanning, satellite imagery, of course, and of course the data from social media becoming increasingly used. Though big data has challenges. New tools and methods and expertise will be required to analyze the data, but particularly greater reliance on estimation methods. Big data can produce large amounts of timely, sometimes real-time data, usually generated at a minimal cost, but which require, as I say, new methods to use and not available to the NSO particularly cheaply. There is a cost to supplying this data, plus the fact that there are very little, often metadata and measures of definitions and concepts that accompany big data. And finally, there is usually concerns about the public acceptability and the legal basis of collecting data in this way, to which the public have no direct control. So, what is my vision for the future? My guess is that, as is the case now in countries such as Sweden and the Netherlands, where the concept of the census is no more than a fading memory, the rest of Europe, at least, will follow suit in due course, and that a 10-year census cycle, whether derived from questionnaires or registers, will be supplemented by more regular but perhaps less detailed univariate statistical outputs as and when they are required by users. Elsewhere in the world, progress is likely to be at a much slower pace, but I think will be inevitable. Maybe we can envisage a time in the not too distant future when the UN will not need to make a global resolution every 10 years, that all countries should conduct at least one census in the following decade. It'll be a free for all. And with that thought, I thank you for listening. We'll be happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ian. That was a very comprehensive and interesting and provocative webinar. And I thank you for all that information. And we'll move on to the Q&A, and perhaps we could start with Attila.
Sure, thank you very much, Archana. Thanks very much, Ian. This was very, very interesting. We have several questions in the chat box. We have about 20 minutes. So I will try to cover two questions at a time so that you can answer them. The first two questions that came in, the first one was about any privacy concerns about using registered data, assuming that they are not anonymized. And maybe I can add from my side, in Europe, for instance, when the move for most countries has happened from traditional census to register-based census, what kind of consent was sought from the population? Because as you pointed out, the information that is coming from administrative sources was not provided by the population for statistical purposes. And the second question is coming from my friend Yan Hong, which is about the coverage. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, for instance, the census has consistently undercounted young children. And do we know the extent of this, the undercounting of children in other countries? And from what I know is that in many countries, the fertility rates estimated by censuses, and you pointed out to the adolescent birth rate, for instance, as an SDG indicator covered by censuses, the fertility rates tend to be underestimated, which means that the undercounting of young children is probably prevalent in many countries. So your comments on this would be appreciated.
Okay, thank you very much. Common concerns, I think both those issues are very relevant. I'll take the privacy concerns first. Yes, there's always privacy concerns in whatever census you do. At least in a traditional census, the public know what information they've provided, and they may not like providing the information, but they know what they provided. And of course, in most countries, it's a legal obligation to do so. Where you've got data taken from a register, the public don't know what data is being used. They know that they are on a register. They're on a tax register, for example. They're on an electoral register. They don't know what that information is being used for. They don't know that it's being used for statistical purposes. So one of the prerequisites, I think, for any country adopting this is then not only have they have the legal base, the legal power to do it. Now, normally, if a government passes an act to make something legal, it has taken public opinion into account. But I think it is still important that the public should be told before a census takes place that this is what the NSO is going to do. But it's quite clear, and I raised this point with big data. If you've got a mobile phone and that data, you're using your mobile phone, and that data is now being used to monitor where you are, how many journeys you make, how far away from home, how many trips to the shops you go. Yes, that's all very worthwhile. That's all maybe very interesting, but public do have concerns about using that data. Identifying people from the data is a different matter, and NSO will always take measures to protect the anonymity and the confidentiality of data through various confidentiality methods. So I don't think there's any risk to disclosure of information. It is just the use of the information without the public's knowledge that is of concern. That has to be managed by every country. I mentioned the Sweden and Norway issue, the Sweden and Netherlands issue. They don't even know a census is taking place. In fact, a census doesn't take place anymore. There is no such thing as a census as an activity. It just means that Sweden and Netherlands every 10 years provide Eurostat with data that is taken from the registers. And users can have it whatever data that it requires, but there's no census data as such published. So the census becomes a concept that is, as I say, forgotten. The matter of coverage is a matter of grave concern in any census. And where you have a traditional field enumeration, you're always going to miss people out. And you quite rightly say children are often undercounted for several reasons. Hopefully, theoretically, if you've got people registered in a population register or in a school register or in a tax register, they will be identified in one register or another. So if you don't count them in one register, you might count them in another. So the theory is, the rationale is that by using a mixture of registers, a combination of registers, you will account for everybody. It's just how you then measure any undercoverage. That's the issue. You may well need to do a post-enumeration survey or an independent survey to assess the accuracy of the registers. It's somewhat ironic that in some countries, registers have been used to measure the accuracy of census data. You carry out a traditional census, you're not quite sure whether there's an undercount or not. So you go to a register to see, well, let's see what's in the register and compare it. Now you're moving to the register. So the census becomes the gold standard and the register becomes the method of checking accuracy. Now it's different. You have your register as your prime data source. How do you know that the register is complete? I know, let's conduct a census to check it, or a survey. So this issue of coverage is cyclical. There's always going to be an undercoverage of population groups and children. And I mentioned the hard to count groups particularly, but children are another cause, are another subgroup. Of course, knowing there's an undercount and measuring the undercount is different. You can live with an undercount if you know what the undercount is. And you can measure that in several ways. And I said a post-enumeration survey is one. You can measure it using demographic techniques. You know what a population pyramid should look like. You know that you know what your birth rate is. You know how many children should be in the population. You can compare that with civil registration data. Now, in countries where civil registration isn't so advanced and isn't uniform, there is an issue. Okay.
Thank you very much, Ian. We have a number of other questions, so let's try to address a few of them. But let's be brief so that we can answer as many questions.
Yes. Okay.
One question is, considering the pandemic situation, are there any donor-supported initiatives which are aiming to strengthen registers and administrative data in the countries? You mentioned that the forecast is that many countries are going to be moving to register-based censuses. So that's good news, not only for the census itself, but from the perspective of strengthening administrative data, in theory. So is there any donor-supported initiatives on this? A second question, not related, but I'm just mentioning them so that you can take the time to answer both of them. There was a question about the success of a census. Is comparability of a census to the previous censuses an indicator of success, or does that fall under just coherence? Because there's sometimes an argument that not changing the wording of a question to keep comparability is a success story. So what do you think about that?
Okay, two different questions. Well, and I'm going to keep my answer short. There is donor support, or certainly technical support provided by UNFPA, for example. I'm working with UNFPA on a number of countries where they are looking at moving towards a register-based system. I mean, support can often come in by way of technical guidance and advice. Donor support implies funding. I'm not particularly expert on where there are fundings, whether the World Bank has a program or UNFPA has a program of helping to support countries. There is a certain amount of funding that goes on, but I agree. The point is that many countries are not equipped. They may well have political motivation to move to a register-based census, particularly if their neighbouring countries have done so, but they just don't have the technical expertise. So the funding in terms of expertise and technical support is often available to countries through organisations such as UNFPA. Comparability is a good point. Often to measure the quality of say a traditional census, you compare it with what went last time. And see whether rolling forward your births, deaths and marriages and migrations gives you a figure that is comparable. And that's the advantage of doing a census very regularly, because you have some idea of the population change. You can have great changes in migration, for example. Births and deaths are quite easy to measure. Migration is less so, and you can have countries where you can have great swathes of in-migration or out-migration. Many countries that are losing population, in Eastern Europe, for example, it is very difficult for them to measure their population accurately. So comparing one census with another is one way of doing it, but if you have a bad census to start with, comparing your good census with a bad census might not be a good idea. But yes, comparability, you can compare census data with all sorts of things. A previous census is one way of doing it. Difficult when you move from one methodology to another, because as you imply in the question, you can ask the same question or change the question. Even the slight change in wording of the question to reflect change in circumstances can actually alter the quality of the data.
Well, thank you very much, Ian. One question was, well, two questions actually, were with regard to satellite imagery. The question was, how accurate is it using satellite imagery for population census estimates in rural areas and congested urban areas? But then let me extend the question and ask something more broad than that. Are most of the censuses now geocoded? What is the status of geocoding enumeration areas, and what happens in the case of moving to register-based censuses? One would assume that if a country is able to move to register-based censuses, then geospatial codes for dwellings, for neighborhoods, is also possible at the same time.
Yes, indeed. Satellite imagery is used not so much for measuring where people are, but certainly for measuring change in urban development. So you could measure dwellings, buildings It's good to identify those, and of course you can geocode them using satellite imagery. Moving to an address register-based data, if you have a good address register, then or a dwelling register with addresses attached, then usually there's a geocode attached to that. There's usually an address. If your address is not coded itself with a zip code or a postcode, you can attach a geocode to it using geocoordinates, and that is often used, for example, when you're preparing grid square data. You attach people to a grid square based on the geocoding. But satellite imagery is not only used, is often used for mapping census areas. It is a good vehicle for doing that. So the answer to your question is yes, satellite imagery can be used for both preparing censuses and analyzing the data. And geocoding is pretty much now universally adopted. It's certainly recommended that addresses be geocoded so that you have a unique address system throughout your register-based data system. Remember, it should be noted that registers are not only, countries will adopt a register-based system, not just for the census. It isn't economic to do it just for the census, but to use it for all their statistical outputs. You create your links, not just for the census, but for all its statistical purposes. So geocoding, I think, would then become pretty much mandatory.
Thank you very much, Ian. That's really important point. That's very useful for people like us. I'm referring to my team, where we conduct household surveys or support household surveys, in which case geospatial data coming from the census, which is used as a sample frame, is very important. One issue that they touched upon was the biases which are introduced by using multi-mode censuses. Could you expand a little bit on the bias that could be introduced by using multi-mode approaches in a census?
Yes, the bias can be introduced from two factors. If you have a paper questionnaire and an electronic questionnaire, for example, this is a common situation. You have your written questions set out on a written questionnaire. The instructions for that must by definition be quite limited, because you've only got a limited amount of space. When you use an online e-questionnaire, you can have all sorts of different explanatory notes. The questionnaire is usually addressed to you as an individual because of the software. So usually using an electronic questionnaire, you induce a better quality answer. Also, you don't see all the questions that are not relevant to you, so you don't think you haven't got 12 pages of questionnaires you think you have to answer. Answering a paper questionnaire can inhibit your answers, can give you a mental attitude to the survey, which is totally different experience if you have an electronic version. So that's one. It's the way that the questions are worded and presented. Even the background, the color background that you're looking at can affect the way that you respond. But there's another different way. The people that respond to one questionnaire will be different to the people that respond to another. Elderly people tend not to like online questionnaires. They would rather have a paper questionnaire. Young people tend to want e-questionnaires. So that the fact that you have got different people answering different modes also introduces a bias in your responses. So that the bias can be kind of evolve for different reasons. The way the question is presented and the people that are actually the profile of the people that are answering it. How you measure that, then I'm not going to go into measuring bias. I mean, there are well-known documented ways of measuring statistical bias, but those are the main causes.
Thank you, Ian. I wonder if you'd like to answer or a couple of questions which are on the same topic. The $1 million question: how do we get administrative data systems, registers improved so that we can all move to censuses? What needs to be done for improving administrative data?
Well, have we got another hour?
Yeah, we do.
I sense another webinar coming on here, Attila. It is a question that is absolutely key and vital, absolutely so. I will answer it very briefly in two ways. One, remember when you're talking about improving the register, I am assuming you mean approving the original administrative registers from which the data is taken, because that is the source of the data. Now remember, registers are taken and are held by different government departments for administrative purposes. It is their responsibility to maintain the register legally and administratively. It is their responsibility to ensure the quality of the data. The NSO, once it uses the data, can, if it thinks there are errors in it, do something to counter that error for coverage, bias, that sort of thing. But it can't improve the register. It isn't their register. They can only report back to the data holder, saying, we think there are errors in your register. What are you going to do about it? But you need total monitoring of registers and comparing one register with another. But remember, the responsibility is of maintaining the quality of the register rests with the register holder and not the NSO. Now, UNECE, I will do a little plug for some work I'm doing. UNECE are currently preparing a set of guidelines on how you assess the quality of registers, and there are certain things that NSOs can do to assess the quality of registers, but there is very little I think they can do to improve the quality of registers because it isn't their responsibility. There is an issue that I will point this because it's quite I will just note this because it is quite an ongoing topic at the moment. There is a question as to whether the NSO, if it sees a mistake in a register that it has used, for example, it knows that a person is missing because in another register that it uses, that person is there. Does it tell the register owner, hey, you got a mistake here, there's someone missing? Or does it just, is it allowed to do that because it is using the register for a non-statistical purpose? There is a deal of thought that says no, a statistical office, even if it knows that there's an error there because it's using the register for statistical purposes, should not then tell the register owner, you've got a mistake here. This person is the wrong age, or no, they're dead. They should be removed from the register, because it is now using the register for administrative purposes, which it is not allowed to do. So this is a moot point. And it's something we could talk on for another hour, I can tell you. But the ways of assessing the quality of a register is a matter that is under consideration. And for one, UNECE are producing a set of guidelines later in the year on that.
Thank you very much, Ian. And we have come to the end. It's exactly 10 o'clock. So thank you so much for this very interesting presentation, this very important topic, for covering this very important topic, and for answering our questions. So I would now ask Archana to close the session.
Sure. Thank you again, everybody. It was a pleasure, Ian, having you part of the webinar series, and we thank you again. I'd just like to remind everyone that this series continues next week. Next Thursday, it will be the webinar entitled Polling Through Social Media Platforms, an example using Facebook with Freuke Kreuter. And we look forward to having you join us then as well. So thank you all again, and thank you for